Good morning. This is episode number 9 of our study of the book of Genesis. This series called Rooted in God's Word, where we're really just studying the Bible, verse by verse, line by line, word by word. Today is Genesis episode number 9, Genesis 4, verses 1 through 15. Adam and Eve have now been expelled from the garden, and we're going to start seeing the result of sin playing out in the world with the infamous story of Cain murdering his brother Abel. So let's jump into this and learn what we can today from Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 15. So chapter 4 starts off in this way. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Well, the idea when it says that Adam knew Eve, his wife, is just a very polite way of saying had sexual relations with his wife, and as a result of that, they conceived and bore a son. The idea of knowing is really related to intimacy, the most intimate relationship. This is the picture of the one flesh relationship that God had spoke about earlier, that a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, they shall become one flesh. This is the ultimate picture of that. Intimacy is to be fully known, to know fully, to feel completely safe, and the sexual relationship is the byproduct of intimacy. When you bypass intimacy and jump straight into a sexual relationship, you are bypassing what God has designed. God has designed the intimate relationship to happen between a husband and a wife, and it to be culminated in the sexual relationship. But the world, as it does with everything, twists God, twists his word, and does things exactly opposite in how God designed. Well, Adam knew his wife Eve. They were husband and wife. They had sexual relations. It was a byproduct of the intimacy, and she bore Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Now, there's something in that statement that she says. The word Cain literally means, and again, in Hebrew, names mean something. They're very specific. It literally means, I've got him, or here he is. What Eve was experiencing was most likely the promise or the consequence that God had given in Genesis 3:15 when he spoke to Satan and said that her seed will basically crush you. You will bruise his heel, he will crush your head. He was talking about the seed of the woman. Now, most likely, Eve did not know the plan, did not know how all of that was going to work out. So she assumed when she had the son that here he was, here he is the one destined to be the Messiah who will crush Satan. So instantly she was thinking that God was going to set things straight according to what he had just said in Genesis 3:15. Now, there's no indication that they had ever had children before this, so this was the first one who was born. Most likely Adam and Eve had no idea what this was going to be like, this whole process of birth. They didn't know if the descendants would come forth fully mature as they were, but they didn't come that way. They came as an infant. No baby had been born, but she was able to raise this child, and this child was, in her mind, the future deliverer, the future Messiah, the one that was promised in Genesis 3:15. That's why she named him Cain. She thought she was holding in her arms this baby who would be Messiah, the Savior of the world, and instead what she was holding in her arms was a murderer, a future murderer. And that had to be painful later to think of as a mom, that this person who I thought would be Messiah instead is a murderer going against the very direction of God. So let's keep going. This is Adam and Eve conceived, had a child. They had Cain. Cain again means here he is. I've got him. They were thinking he was going to be the Messiah that was promised in Genesis 3:15, and it goes on to describe the rest of the story. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. And so you have two children that are being born here. We have Abel, and then we have Cain. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And so we have to assume that at some point this is describing them years later after they have grown into manhood. So years later, I don't know how many years later, but Abel and Cain were both grown. Abel, a keeper of the sheep. Cain was a tiller of the ground. So Cain was a farmer. Abel had livestock and took care of the livestock. And so there is nothing that is being said, but the assumption could be made that there were many other children that were born from that time. So from the time of Adam and Eve, there were more children that were born. Now people discuss and talk about, well, how did Cain and Abel did they marry their sisters? How did that work? And if you think about the process that Adam and Eve being in perfection, there was no genetic defects that would pass down from generation to generation. So they did not have to worry about the what would be considered today incestuous relationships, because the genetic birth defects would not have been passing down from those generations. And so there's very likelihood, and well, it would have been the only way, they would have married sisters, and then they would have had children, and then you would have cousins that would become married, then second cousins, and so on and so forth, and that would happen going forward. So between Abel and Cain growing into adults, there were other kids that were being born and others that were having children. You could assume that Abel and Cain probably had become married by then, probably even had children of their own. Again, it doesn't say, but we can make some assumptions when you start reading this. God didn't include all of those details, but we can make some assumptions on things that he possibly could have included. Well, it goes on to say this. Abel was a keeper of the sheep. Cain was a tiller of the ground. In the process of time, so there's a period of time. We don't know how long that process of time is, but it says in the process of time. So there's a period of time. It could be several hundred years for all that we know. We do not know how long of time that was. But it came to pass that Cain brought an offering. He brought an offering of the fruit of the ground. So he brought an offering of the crops that he was working with. He brought it to the Lord. Now, we don't know where he brought it to the Lord. Some assumptions have been made that probably to the cherubim that was guarding the tree of life that would not let them get there. They're always associated with the dwelling place of God, so they would have been the intermediary potentially between God and mankind. So maybe that's where they took the offering. We don't really know. It doesn't say. It just says that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Now, Abel also brought an offering of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. Now, when the offerings came to God, it says that the Lord respected. Now, just notice that word, the Lord respected. Now, that means he had regard for. He appreciated. He had regard for. He accepted Abel and his offering, but he did not respect. So now it's saying he did not respect Cain and his offering. Well, why did God receive one of the offerings? Why did he respect one of the offerings? Why did he appreciate one of the offerings and he did not appreciate the other type of offering? Well, I want you to think about the two types of offering that are being offered. It says that Abel, he offered what? He offered the firstborn. So he offered the firstborn and their fat, Now, there's something in that statement that is very telling. Cain also brought an offering, and he brought some of the fruit. Now, I've heard preachers preach and try to make some assumptions that God had regard for Abel because he brought a blood offering. He did not have regard for Cain because Cain just brought grain. Well, that's not true. That can't even possibly be the case, because God has regard for offerings that are given, both grain offerings and animal offerings, all throughout the Old Testament. God accepted both. They were both perfectly acceptable to him. The difference between the two offerings were this little key phrase: firstborn and some of. Now, it doesn't say some of, it just says of the fruit, but I'm just putting that word in there because that's what's being communicated. Abel brought of the firstborn, and Cain brought some of. Now, ask yourself this question: which is the greater stepping out in faith, if you bring God some of, or if you bring God the firstborn? Well, the obvious answer is that the greater picture of faith is the one who brings the firstborn. Now, why would that possibly be? It's the principle of first fruits. If you bring the firstborn, if you bring the first fruits, there's no guarantee that you're going to have any others. So let's just say this, that Cain and Abel, or that Abel has his livestock. He's got sheep in the livestock, and a little lamb is born. If he takes that lamb immediately, brings it to the Lord as an offering, well, there's no guarantee that another lamb is going to be born. He may have just cut off his flock immediately. The sheep may not ever have another one. They may be barren from that point. So it's a great step of faith to say, God, here's the first. I'm going to trust you for the rest. If you bring some of the fruit, it's like this. It's like you have a crop of 1,000 acres. You've already harvested all 1,000 acres, and once you already have that in the barns, okay, then I'm going to give you 100 of the acres. After the fact, after I've already harvested all 1,000. It's all safely in the barn. I don't have to worry about my portion. I'm going to go ahead and give you after I have already harvested it all. It takes a greater step of faith to say, God, I will give you the first. I had a good friend who was a farmer. And this farmer had a lot of acres that he would farm every year. It was a massive sized farm. Every year, as soon as he got the first grain off of his fields, as the combines are harvesting and as they get the grain off, he takes the trucks, the semi-trucks, and sends it to the elevator, and he gives instructions to the elevator once they've received the grain that I want you to write the check of this first crop to the church. Now, how is that a step of faith? Well, there was no guarantee that the rest of the crop was going to come in. You see, the rest of the crop could have gotten hailed out, frozen out, rained out. There's no guarantee that any other crop is going to come in. That's a step of faith. When you say to God, here's the first, and I will trust you for everything else, it is a picture of a heart that is filled with faith. Cain's heart was demonstrating that it was not filled with faith. It was almost like God was just getting the leftovers. He was getting the afterthoughts. Now, Cain may have given him plenty of offering, but it was an afterthought. It was after the harvest had already come in. That's exactly what's going on in this picture. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, it says this, by faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he is being dead, though he is dead, still it is speaking. So it was a better offering. It was a more excellent sacrifice. How? Not because it was blood, it was because it was the first. He was giving God the very first. Do you give God the very first in every aspect of your life? Your first fruits, your first talents, your first ability. Are you dedicating the first to God and trusting Him for everything else? That's the picture of faith that God is asking us to do. Oftentimes, that picture of faith happens when it comes to money. When you receive money in, the first goes to God, and then you trust Him for the rest. You may wonder, where is it going to come from? How am I going to meet my needs? Well, God is a faithful God. And if you give Him the first, trust Him, He will provide for the rest. It's how God works. He has worked in that way in my life personally in many, many ways over the years. And so that's why God had regard. Now, what was the end result of all of this? What happened as a result of this offering and the situation that was going on? Well, it says this, when Cain realized, and we don't know how he realized this, how did God show that he had respect for Abel and not respect for Cain? How did he show he had regard for Abel and not for Cain? How did he appreciate Abel's offering and not Cain's? We don't know. Somehow Cain knew, and when Cain heard this, he became very angry, and his countenance fell. What was going on was this. His heart, his countenance, and his attitude, anger, was revealing what was really in his heart. His offering also was revealing what was really in his heart. And what was in his heart was not okay. And what the end result of what that was coming out of his heart was anger, and his countenance fell. An angry person reveals what is really going on in their heart. If you struggle with anger, it means there's a deeper issue in your heart. And that issue in your heart has to be resolved before you can really walk with God the way that he wants you to. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean you don't have a relationship with God. I'm saying that that is something that God wants to do a deeper work in your life to get you to the point where your heart is full of faith and your anger has been resolved and your countenance reflects the joy of the Lord, the joy of walking with him. Well, out of that hard heart, out of that angry attitude, out of that disturbing countenance, out of that offering that was given that was not pleasing to the Lord because it was more of an afterthought, it was not the first fruits, we are going to see Cain reacting. And here's how Cain reacts. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, Cain? Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." And so he says to Cain these questions. Cain, I'm seeing that you're angry. I'm seeing that your countenance has fallen. Cain, I'm seeing that in your heart there's a problem. In your heart there is a hardness. There is a wickedness that is in there. Sin is creeping into your heart. Sin is getting a foothold in your heart, and sin is causing hardness. What sin does is it creates weeds growing up in your heart that chokes out the life of God. Why? I'm seeing this in your heart, Cain. Why is it going on in your heart? I'm seeing a problem here. Sin is in your heart. It's trying to control you. So that's what its desire is for you, meaning that sin is trying to control you. But instead, you need to rule over it, which means you better control that sin in your heart before something else happens. You better deal with the problem that is there. Anger is the sign and the evidence that there is a problem. Your countenance falling is the sign and the evidence that there's a problem. The real problem, God says, is sin, and it is trying to control you, but you had better control it. How do you control sin? Well, you confess it. You repent of it. You bring it to the Lord. You ask for forgiveness. You deal with your sin so that it doesn't go further and create more problems. Because if you don't, it is going to create a future problem that you are going to regret deeply in your life. We all know that. We have faced the consequences of sin in our lives that if we had just controlled it and ruled it at the time, it would have never gotten as far as it did. There's times in my own life that I look back and I think if I had just ruled over that sin, that attitude, that heart issue in my life, it would have not proceeded further. Instead of ruling it, I let it rule me, and it created problems. It created consequences. It created turmoil. We are called to rule over those sinful things in our heart. Those sinful things have a desire to control us, but we can control it. We do not have to succumb to the sin. We choose to do so. We can bring it to God, confess it before God, ask for forgiveness from God, ask for strength from God, have somebody else in your life as an accountability partner to help you through this. We have the ability to rule over it and control it rather than let it control us. Well, this problem that is crouching at the door, that is lying in wait, that reminds me of how Satan tries to get a foothold in our lives. You know, he's at the door, and as soon as we open the door to him, he sticks his foot in the door and we can't close it anymore. Once the door is cracked open and Satan gets a foothold, then he moves in and gets a stronghold into our hearts. That's the way it works. So the foothold is, and think about it this way, and I used the example before of the D-Day situation. So think of D-Day. The D-Day situation for the Allies when they were in World War II attacking the German powers, when they had D-Day and they were able to get onto the beach, that was a foothold that they were able to get. Once you get your foot in the door, you've got a foothold. Then, once they took the beaches and they began to move inward, then they got a stronghold. And what is a stronghold? Well, the stronghold is when you can start to build structures. You can build storage buildings. You can build towers. You can build castles. You start to build strongholds, but strongholds don't happen until they get a foothold. Well, that's how sin works in our hearts. God comes in, or Satan comes in, crouching at the door. As soon as we open the door just a little bit, we're just a little bit tempted, we open the door, he sticks his foot in, and now we can't close it anymore. And now him sticking the foot in is now developing into a stronghold where he starts building a castle in our hearts. He starts to build a castle and erect a stronghold in our hearts, where he starts to fly his flag in our heart because he's got a stronghold. That happens with people. Look at alcohol, for example. People take one drink, that's the foothold, and then they can't stop. Satan gets his foot in the door, and now it's turned into a stronghold that it becomes not just one drink, it's many, many drinks every day. Can't control it, destroying my family. Men allow this to happen with pornography. One look, one going to a certain website, one magazine, one video, and all of a sudden it goes from that into now I can't control it, and it is a stronghold in my heart. Satan operates through the foothold principle. It's crouching at the door to get a foothold. And once you open the door and once a foothold is gained, it is not very far until Satan has a stronghold built. When you've opened the door and he gets his foot in is when you have to confess it. You have to bring it to the Lord. You have to have accountability. You have to kick him out of your heart. You can't let him get access. You can't let him build a stronghold, because once a stronghold is erected, it is almost impossible to tear down without the power of the Holy Spirit and his dynamite that blows up the castle that Satan has built. And it is hard work and takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of accountability for that to happen. And that's exactly what he was saying to Cain. Cain's sin is lying at your door. He is crouching there. He wants a foothold so that he can build a stronghold. And once he has a stronghold, it will wreck you. Well, for Cain, Satan had got his foot in the door. And for Cain, it wasn't just a foothold. It was a stronghold, because we're going to see how it's exposed in the next verses. So let's look. Now Cain talked with his brother Abel, his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Now there is the sense in this verse that Cain planned to catch Abel by surprise by luring him into the fields with pleasant conversation. This shows that Cain was committing a premeditated murder, and therefore ignoring God's plan of escape that he had given him in just the verse before. When God said to Cain, you had better master this. It has a desire for you. It wants to control you. Satan wants his foot in the door. You had better control it. You rule it. Don't let it rule you. Well, Cain just ignored that. He was premeditating the murder because he lured him out. This was not in the heat of the moment where Cain just flipped and murdered him. Cain led him out with pleasant conversation into the field where he could murder his brother Abel. It wasn't just a reactionary thing. It was a premeditated murder based upon the situation that happened. And this is really setting the stage for sin that would be carried down throughout the generations. A hard-hearted heart that is going against the very will and plan of God. Well, following the murder, then the Lord God is going to confront Cain. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" So Cain replied in a very snarky way, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" So God asked the question of Cain. Now, God knew the answer to this question. He's an omniscient God. He's an omnipresent God. He is an all-powerful God. God knew the answer to the question, but he was giving Cain an opportunity to confess his sin and to start to do right after having done wrong. How futile would it have been for Cain to lie to God? It's just madness to think that God did not know where Abel was, or that he could actually hide his sins from God. But he was denying God's power. He denied who God was. He was denying the all-knowing part of God. He was really reacting in a way that made us think that his heart had grown so hard that he had a form of godliness but denied the power of God. 2 Timothy 3:5. He responds in this way, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, this is one of the famous lines that you'll hear quoted in many different ways, in many different respects. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, the answer to that question is absolutely yes. You are supposed to be your brother's keeper. Instead of being your keeper, though, his keeper, you became his murderer, and you murdered him for one of the lowest of reasons out there, just because you were jealous. It was spiritual jealousy. He hadn't done anything to you. He had not done you wrong in any way. You were spiritually jealous, and as a result, you murdered him. You were supposed to be his keeper. You were supposed to be his protector. You have each other's backs. That's what brothers are supposed to do, and instead you turned on him out of pure jealousy, not because he had done anything wrong. Charles Spurgeon said this about this verse in his commentaries and in his preaching. He said, "The cool impudence of Cain is an indication of the state of heart which led up to his murdering of his brother. It was also a part of the result of his having committed that terrible crime. He would not have proceeded to the cruel deed of bloodshed if he had not first cast off the fear of God and been ready to defy his Maker." See, he had cast off the fear of God. He didn't fear God. He didn't care about what God would say or what God would think or how God would react. He did not fear him at all, so he just went ahead and did what he was going to do. Really, most people that commit sin, it's not, most often it's, I don't really fear God. I don't fear what he's going to do. I don't fear having to stand before him, to give an account before him, standing before the throne of God. I'm not worried about that, so I will just do what I want to do. And that's exactly what Cain did. Cain murdered his brother out of spiritual jealousy, not worrying about God, not having a fear of God in his mind at all. He just went ahead. That's what secular humanism or atheism is the fact that you do not fear God. You have no regard for God. You don't believe in a God, so you can just react and do whatever it is that you want to, act in any way that you want to, because there's no consequences. You'll never have to face a consequence out of your decision to go against the commands and the mandates of who God is. Well, it says that. So God says, "Cain, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." So God knew this. He already knew that that he had murdered Abel. Well, God says to Cain, here's the consequence. You are now cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground. Now remember, he was the farmer and he would grow crops, and he was probably very successful at growing crops. But now when you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. So the curse upon Cain that was really that Adam's curse would be amplified in regard to Cain. If bringing forth food from the earth would be hard for Adam, according to Genesis chapter 3, it's going to be impossible for Cain, who was a farmer. If Adam were driven out of Eden, Genesis 3, Cain would find no resting place on the earth. He will find no community, no connection. He will be alone. He will be a vagabond. He will wander around, barely able to survive, to sustain life. That's more of a punishment, really, than just killing him outright. God could have just killed him outright, but now to have no community, to have no closeness, to have nothing in life, just to wander around with your guilt, not being able to produce crops from the land would be an incredible punishment for Cain. To be driven away probably from family, from loved ones, maybe from a wife, maybe from children that he would have had, would be an incredible pain that he would go through. He would be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. Now, Cain is going to complain about the severity of God's punishment, but I don't think God really cares about the complaints of him. Let's look. And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." So we can understand and we can assume that at some point and in some way they were able to interact with God. I'm going to be driven from your face. Not only your face, but the face of the ground. You have driven me out this day. This is greater than I can bear. Now, I want you to notice something here, and this is very, very true of people that sin, but they don't feel bad about their sin. They only feel bad about their punishment. You know anybody like that? The sin doesn't bother them. The punishment does. They feel worse about the punishment than they do about the acts that they committed. They face consequences, they face punishment, but that doesn't really, that's more important to them than the sin that they actually committed. So Cain is experiencing right here and demonstrating right here that he does not feel bad about murder. He doesn't feel bad about this. He only feels bad about how it's affected him, and that is the punishment that he receives. He doesn't feel bad about his mother and father, A&E, who lost their son. He doesn't feel bad about hurting the heart of God, who told him not to do this. He doesn't feel bad about potentially if Abel had a wife. We don't know, but let's make the assumption that he had a wife. He doesn't feel bad about that. He doesn't feel bad about the children that Abel and his wife may have had. He doesn't feel bad about any of that. There's no guilt in any of that. What does he feel guilty about and bad about? The fact that he is going to be punished and the punishment is too severe. One of the clearest marks of sin is our almost innate desire to excuse ourselves and complain in the way that we are judged. Donald Barnhouse said this about this scene. He said one of the consequences of sin is that it makes the sinner pity himself instead of causing him to turn to God. One of the first signs of new life is that the individual takes sides with God against himself. If you didn't understand what I just read there, that's important to understand. You care more about how it affects you than how it affects God. When you have finally been born again, you have a new life. Now you care more about how this has affected God, and you care less about how it affects you. That's what Cain is demonstrating. He cares more about the punishment that he is going to receive than the wrong that he did. When you come to Christ, things change completely. And instead, you care more about the sin that you have done than the punishment that you have received. In fact, you realize that the punishment that you received probably isn't enough compared to the sin that you have actually committed. You start to see yourself through God's eyes when you come to him, and you realize that my sin is awful, and I don't care about the punishment to me. I care about what I have done and whom I have hurt and the sin that I have committed. Well, it says this, and we're going to conclude with these words. And the Lord said to him, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. We don't know what the mark is. We've speculated and people have wondered, but nobody knows what the mark that was set upon Cain. We just know that God gave a warning that if anybody touches him, you will be killed, and it will be sevenfold worse if you do this. Instead, you just let him go. Let him be a fugitive. Let him be a vagabond. He will have no connection, no community, no closeness with God ever again. He is done for, and he will wander around until the end of his life, until it all comes to an end. Well, that's the story of Cain and Abel and how all of this really reflects sin in our own hearts and in our own lives today. Well, hopefully that was helpful to you. Hopefully you learned something from our study today. Next time we will jump into Genesis chapter 4, picking it up in verse 16 with Cain and his descendants as they move away. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you back here next time.